Mechanic fired after 30 years. Weeks later he returns, and everyone freezes. Frank Sullivan had devoted 30 years to the same garage. 30 years filled with grease-stained hands, busted knuckles, and countless late nights beneath the hood of a vehicle. He built that shop from the ground up, transforming a small-town auto repair shop into one of the most trusted establishments in the city. Customers didn't visit merely for repairs. They came knowing Frank would never deceive them. But none of that held any value today, because today he was being thrown out like refuse. Frank stood in front of Greg Miller's desk, the man who had assumed control of the shop after Old Man Carter had passed. Greg was younger, well-dressed, and more interested in profit margins than in people. He reclined in his pricey chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "I'm sorry, Frank. Business is business," he stated in a tone so casual it was as if he were asking Frank to pass the salt at dinner. Frank gritted his teeth. 30 years. Greg. I trained half the guys in this shop. I kept the place running when Carter fell ill. And you are just letting me go." Greg sighed, as if the conversation was wearing him out. "Look, you're excellent at your job. No doubt about that. But times are changing. We need younger mechanics who can work faster for lower wages. I have investors to consider." "It's nothing personal." Frank felt a tightening in his chest, but he wouldn't let Greg see it. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "So, what's next?" Frank asked, his voice steady. "You want me to gather my tools and walk out as if I was never here?" Greg shrugged. "Pretty much. There's a severance package. A few months' pay. Consider it a thank you for your service." Frank let out a slow breath. His hands formed fists, but he forced himself to remain composed. Greg wasn't worth losing his dignity over. He turned, heading for the door. But just before he exited, he paused and looked over his shoulder, his voice low but firm. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." Frank left without looking back. By the time he reached his station, his toolbox was already packed. His name, which had once adorned a plaque above his workspace for decades, was gone, erased. The younger mechanics barely made eye contact as he walked by. Some seemed guilty, while others looked relieved it wasn't them. Outside, the sharp wind hit his face as he stepped into the parking lot. His old truck sat in its usual spot, but this time it felt different. He wouldn't be returning. Frank haphazardly tossed his toolbox into the truck bed and got in. Gripping the steering wheel, he stared ahead. 30 years of his life vanished in moments. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He had no clue what was next. Frank drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights fading past his windshield, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. After 30 years in one location, he found himself with nowhere to go. That thought burned in his chest like a fire he couldn't extinguish. He had lost more than just a job. He had lost his purpose. Finally, he pulled into the driveway of his small house, the same one he had occupied for 20 years. The porch light flickered as he stepped out of the truck, toolbox in hand. Inside, silence hit him like a wave. No engine running, no smell of oil or metal, just emptiness. He set his toolbox on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, running his hands through his graying hair. He had never anticipated this outcome. He always believed he would retire from that garage, perhaps train the next generation, passing on the knowledge he had amassed over the years. Yet Greg had snatched that away from him in mere seconds. His eyes landed on an old photograph hanging on the wall. It was him and Carter, the original owner of the shop, standing in front of the garage on its opening day. Carter had been more than just a boss. He had been a mentor, a friend who believed in hard work and loyalty. Had he been alive today, he would have been ashamed of what had transpired. Frank clenched his jaw and turned away. He needed to figure out what came next. The following morning, he woke up early out of habit. His body was accustomed to the routine of getting dressed, heading to the shop, and working until his hands ached. But today, there was nowhere to go. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at his calloused hands. He had never done anything else. Then a thought brushed through his mind. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There had to be someone, some shop, some old friend, who needed a mechanic. One by one, he called the numbers, and one by one, he received the same response. We're not hiring. Budgets are tight. We'll keep you in mind. Frank exhaled sharply, placing the phone down. He had never felt this useless in his life. That afternoon, he drove around town, stopping at every shop he could locate. Some places had kids barely out of school working the bays, while others had owners who looked at his age and saw a liability rather than an asset. Hours passed, and with every rejection, hope drained from him. As he sat in his truck outside the last shop on his list, something caught his attention: a small run-down garage at the edge of town. The sign was faded and barely legible, and the lot was empty. Yet Frank recognized the name. It had belonged to an old mechanic he once knew, someone who had been around as long as he had. Curiosity tugged at him, and he pulled into the lot. The building seemed abandoned, but the door was unlocked. Inside, the space was a disaster. Dust-covered tools, broken-down cars, and an air of neglect as if no one had worked there in years. Then an idea ignited in his mind. He had spent 30 years building someone else's business. Maybe it was time to construct his own. Frank stood in the middle of the dusty garage, his boots firmly planted on the cracked concrete floor. The place had the odor of old oil and forgotten potential. He ran a hand over a rusted toolbox, tracing the outline of something that had once been great but had since been left to decay. He could feel it in his bones. This place had a history that could not be bought, only earned. For years, he had poured his sweat and soul into making Greg's shop the best in town, and where had that gotten him? Tossed aside and forgotten. But this place, this was different. Frank walked to the garage door and heaved it open. Sunlight flooded in, illuminating the airborne dust. He could almost envision it, the way it could be. Cars lined up outside, people bringing their vehicles to someone they could trust, a mechanic who would not deceive them, his own shop. The thought quickened his pulse. But then reality set in. It was a mess. The equipment was outdated. The lift was rusted. And who knew if the wiring even functioned? It would take more money than he possessed just to get it operational. And then there was the biggest problem: customers. How would he convince people to trust a new shop, especially when Greg's business had a stranglehold on the entire town? Most of Frank's old clients continued to go there, and Greg would ensure none of them left. Frank exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe this was a mistake. Perhaps he was simply chasing a dream that would never materialize. Then he heard tires rolling up outside, and his stomach churned. No one should be here. He stepped outside to see an old man climbing out of a worn pickup truck. His clothes were tattered, and his face bore the marks of age. But Frank recognized him immediately. Tom Reed. Frank hadn't seen him in years. But Tom had once been a legend in the industry, having owned a shop that drew customers from miles away simply because they knew he was the best. Frank had learned so much from observing him work. Tom leaned against his truck, eyeing Frank with a knowing grin. Word around town is you got kicked to the curb. Frank crossed his arms. News travels fast. Tom chuckled. It always does in a town like this. His gaze shifted toward the garage. So, what's the plan? Frank hesitated. I don't know if I have one. Tom scoffed. That's not the Frank Sullivan I know. You're the best damn mechanic in this town, and you always have been. Frank released a slow breath. Even if I fix this place up, no one will come. Greg has already taken them all. Tom nodded as if he expected that response. He moved to the back of his truck, lifted the tailgate, and retrieved a battered toolbox. I say we change that. Frank frowned. We? Tom grinned. I may be old, but I still know my way around an engine, and I've got something Greg doesn't. Frank raised an eyebrow. Tom patted the toolbox. Loyal customers who have been waiting for a reason to leave that place. Frank felt something ignite within him. Maybe this could actually work. He stood there, staring at Tom, the significance of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just a casual conversation. Tom meant business. And if there was one thing Frank had learned in his 30 years as a mechanic, it was that men like Tom didn't waste time on lost causes. Frank exhaled, glancing back at the dusty garage. You really think people will come here? Tom smirked. They will if they know you're running it. People are tired of Greg's nonsense. They just need an excuse to walk away. Frank wanted to believe that, but starting a shop from scratch wasn't a small task. It required money, tools, equipment, things he didn't possess. It seemed Tom could read his mind. He opened his toolbox and pulled out a faded checkbook. I've got some savings. Not much, but enough to get this place running. Frank's eyes widened. Tom, I can't take your money. You're not taking it, Tom insisted. I'm investing in a shop that actually cares about people. You fix the cars. I'll handle the business side. Tom placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. We'll make this work. Frank swallowed hard. He had spent the last 2 weeks feeling like his life was over. But here was Tom, offering him a lifeline, a second chance. He looked at the garage once more, envisioning it not as the run-down mess it was, but as the bustling shop it could become. Turning back to Tom, he said, All right, let's do this. And just like that, the spark was ignited. For the next few days, Frank and Tom rolled up their sleeves. They cleaned out the garage, scrubbing away years of dust and grime from every surface. Tom made calls to old contacts, securing deals on used equipment. Frank devoted hours to repairing the rusted lift, rewiring the lights, and ensuring everything in the shop was functional. Word began to spread, and a few of Frank's old customers stopped by. Curiosity piqued. They watched him work, remembering why they had trusted him for so long. Then one morning, a woman arrived in a minivan, her face etched with worry. I heard you were open. My car's been making a noise, but Greg's shop told me it would take 2 weeks just to look at it. Frank nodded, popped the hood. Within minutes, he diagnosed the problem. A loose belt, a quick fix. When he handed the keys back to her, she was amazed. Greg told me I needed a full repair. He was going to charge me hundreds. Frank wiped his hands on a rag. You're all set. No charge for something that small. Her eyes filled with gratitude. I'm telling everyone about this place. And she did. Within hours, more cars began rolling in, people complaining about how Greg had overcharged them or pushed unnecessary repairs. Frank and Tom worked tirelessly, fixing cars honestly and fairly. The trust began to return. But Greg wasn't pleased. That evening, as Frank locked up, a black luxury car pulled into the lot. The door swung open, and Greg stepped out, his face unreadable, but his eyes blazed with something Frank couldn't quite define. Greg took a deliberate step forward. So this is what you've been up to? Frank crossed his arms. You seem surprised. Greg smirked, but it held no amusement. You made a mistake, old man. Tom stepped up beside Frank. The only mistake was thinking you could keep running a business by cheating people. Greg's jaw tightened. You're not going to last. Frank met his gaze. We'll see about that. Greg let out a dark chuckle, climbed back into his car, and drove off. Tom exhaled. He's not done yet. Frank nodded. He knew Greg too well. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Frank arrived at the shop early, but something felt off. As he approached, his stomach twisted. The front door was wide open, and the lock had been shattered. His heart raced as he rushed inside. Tools were scattered everywhere, drawers pulled open. The register was missing. His toolbox, the one he'd owned for decades, was gone. Tom rushed in behind him, freezing in his tracks. No! He surveyed the destruction, his face tightening with rage. Frank clenched his fists. He knew exactly who was responsible. Greg. It was the only explanation. Greg had seen the shop rising, customers departing his garage, and had warned Frank he wouldn't last. Now, this. Tom kicked a broken chair aside. We need to call the cops. Frank exhaled sharply, shaking his head. We have no proof. He'll deny everything. Tom was fuming. So we just let this go? Frank looked around at the devastation, his chest heavy. No, we won't let it go. By noon, word had spread through the town, and customers appeared, gasping at the sight of the shop. One woman, Mrs. Carter, crossed her arms. Greg did this, didn't he? Frank didn't confirm it, but his silence spoke volumes. People exchanged whispers. Disgust etched on their faces. A few men stepped forward. We're not letting him get away with this. We'll help you rebuild. Frank's throat tightened. He had spent 30 years working for a company that tossed him aside. Yet now, after just a few weeks, people were rallying in his defense. By the end of the day, the shop was cleaner than ever. Someone donated tools. Another brought a new register. The town had spoken. Greg's attempt at destruction had instead strengthened them. But Greg wasn't finished yet. That night, as Frank locked up, he noticed a car parked across the street. Its headlights off. A figure inside watching. He turned to Tom. We need to be ready. He's not done. The next morning, Frank arrived early, his mind still on the car that had been watching them the previous night. He sensed this was far from over. As he stepped inside, determination surged within him. Greg could try to intimidate them, try to undermine them, but he would not prevail. Tom arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffees. Did you sleep at all? Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Too much on my mind. Tom handed him a cup. Well, brace yourself because we're about to get real busy. Frank frowned. What do you mean? Tom smirked, pulling out his phone. People are talking. Word has spread all over town about what happened. They know what Greg did, and they're done with him. I've been getting messages all morning. People want their cars fixed, and they want you to do it. Frank barely had time to respond before cars began pulling in. Then another, and another. Within moments, the lot was filled. A man stepped forward, shaking Frank's hand. I've been going to Greg for years, but not anymore. I'm not giving my money to someone who tries to destroy honest people. Another woman behind him nodded. Same here. He charged me for a repair I didn't even need. I should have come here sooner. Frank gazed at the growing crowd, overwhelmed. People weren't just bringing their business. They were bringing their trust. For the next few hours, Frank and Tom worked non-stop, fixing cars, changing oil, replacing tires. Each time Frank looked up, more cars were pulling in. The shop thrived in a way he had never envisioned. Then, just as Frank was wiping his hands on a rag, that familiar black luxury car rolled into the lot. It was Greg. He stepped out, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he merely stood there, observing the bustling shop, the happy customers, and the life around him. Then, he approached Frank. You proved your point. Frank crossed his arms. Did I? Greg sighed, looking around. You took everything I built. Frank shook his head. No, you destroyed what you built. I merely offered people another option. Greg stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. As he drove away, Frank felt something he hadn't sensed in weeks. Peace. Tom clapped him on the back. You did it. Frank surveyed the shop, the people, and the life they had created. No, he said with a smile. We did it. The lesson from this story is profound. Integrity and hard work always prevail in the end. Frank dedicated 30 years of his life to his job, only to be discarded without a second thought. Yet instead of giving up, he held his ground, rebuilt himself, and gained the respect of an entire town. His journey illustrates that when you do the right thing, people recognize it, and support will come in ways you never anticipated. Greg, on the other hand, thought power and greed would shield him. He believed he could shatter someone's future without consequences. But in the end, he lost everything, not because Frank fought him, but because his own dishonesty caught up with him.